Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome here our special guest today, Dr. Charles Burton, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and former diplomat at Canada's embassy in Beijing. Dr. Burton specializes in comparative politics, government, and politics of China and Canada-China relations, and also human rights. Welcome, sir.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And before we start the questions I've got prepared for you, let's say that my name is Filip. I will be the host of the interview, focused on politics of China, Canada-China relations, and also the human rights. And this interview is on behalf of the Institute for Politics and Society. Dr. Burton, there is a myriad of questions that I would like to talk about and to ask you, and I have tried to outline a few questions I find very interesting and also quite pressing given the international development and the situation in international order nowadays. My first question and the topic that I've prepared is related to Canada as a good international citizen that has been proclaimed for many years. It's a country that's built on fundamental rights, freedoms, and I would say its strongest asset is in the international arena for years has been its soft power. However, given the recent events in the international system, we can see the conflict in Ukraine, the Israel-Palestinian conflict nowadays, it seems like hard power still plays the first fiddle. So, how is Canada getting on in international space nowadays, and what are the prospects for the future?
I think that certainly, the Canadian government and Canadians at large feel that Canada is an important moral leader in the world. We did have hard power in the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, Canada had the world's third largest navy. But the world has changed a lot since then, and a lot of new powers have emerged. After the Second World War, I think in the process of decolonization from Britain and France, Canada, having been a colony of both Britain and France in history, felt that we could take a leading role in establishing alliances with third world nations and bringing them into the rules-based international order under liberal democratic norms. So there were a lot of high ideals. And then later on in the 50s, when there was the Suez Crisis in the Middle East, Canada played quite a significant role in popularizing the idea of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, and Canada contributed to UN peacekeeping missions. But in the subsequent years, Canada's expenditure on defense has declined as a portion of Canada's national income considerably. We have never achieved the NATO's recommendation of 2% of GDP to defense, and now our military is, considerably less than it should be, considering the population and prosperity of Canada. And this has led to a degree of exclusion of Canada from important international multilateral institutions. So, Canada's not a member of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. The Australia, UK, US alliance in Indo-Pacific also doesn't include Canada, even though Canada's an Indo-Pacific nation and the UK is not. Canada, surprisingly, is not a member of the US's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has, I think about 17 countries in it. So the idea that Canada's not one of them is quite striking. And I think that Canada's virtue signaling on international issues is less and less paid attention to, because, soft power has to be backed by meaningful hard power. And most recently, Canada has had a strong dispute with India over an allegation the Canadian Prime Minister made that senior levels of the Indian government may have been involved in the assassination of a Sikh independentist leader in Canada, a Canadian citizen, who, was shot by a hit squad. People appeared out of nowhere and blasted through the window of his truck, killing him. When Canada attempted to seek support from our fellow G20 20 nations and G7 nations and the Five Eyes, none of them were really prepared to stand with Canada to insist that India should be forthcoming with regard to this incident. Nor, for that matter, did the Prime Minister provide fulsome evidence of this very serious allegation. So Canada's position in the world has declined. I think there's a recognition among our allies that Canada's relations with China are very weak due to circumstances such as the arbitrary detention of 2 Canadian citizens when Canada held the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou pending a US extradition request. And so Canada, you know, not being on the outs with 2 major powers and for that matter, of declining importance in our alliance with the United States, I think Canada is seeing itself in a marginalized position where, you know, leaders may pretend that Canada is an important leader in soft power, but in fact we seem to be a more or less non-player in a lot of aspects of the current increasingly tense situation in the Middle East, with Iran backing, you know, the situation in Israel, which could turn into a larger conflict, and with regard to the European conflict involving Ukraine. And increasingly one wonders to what extent Canada could make a meaningful contribution if there's an outbreak of military hostilities in the Indo-Pacific. So we'd have a three-front war, Middle East, Europe, and Indo-Pacific, and Canada really doesn't have the resources to be able to effectively contribute to really any of them, not to speak of 3 at once.
Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned that Canada's position is marginalized, and would you say that it's possible to mention that it's vulnerable nowadays? Would you consider it a vulnerable position in the international arena, given that I would say there are a lot of things prevailing from the past, perceiving Canada as a good international citizen, as a strong soft power, but you've given me a lot of examples that contradict actually this statement. So what are the prospects? What should Canada do to increase its influence and to increase its role in the international system? Because once a great power seems to be waning, like continually.
Yeah, I think traditionally over the past decades, Canada has downplayed its contribution to defense and security, to some extent on ideological grounds, a general hostility towards military violence, and you know, Canada is very strong on denuclearization and attempting to resolve conflicts, and also because there was an assumption that Canada could rely on the United States for our defense. So if there was a threat from the north, from Russia, that because, you know, the Russian missiles would pass over Canada on their way to the United States, that US power would knock them down. And most recently, in the instant of the Chinese spy balloon, which was wafting over the Canadian North, it was shot down with the assistance of the United States. Canada didn't have the aircraft that were able to fly at sufficient altitude to deal with this thing ourselves. So I think that we are vulnerable. I think the United States is increasingly concerned about Canada's lack of contribution, and particularly if there's a future Trump presidency, you know, Canada could be left to our own devices. But it's very hard to gain political support for a massive reinvestment in defense and security. You know, the popular will is more oriented towards domestic issues like, say, universal dental care or reduction of interest rates to make housing more affordable. And the idea that we would transfer resources from one area into defense is not something that is politically advisable. But it's possible under a new government. There may be a conservative government elected in the next election. There will be a more serious approach taken to Canada making a significant contribution to NATO and other multilateral defense institutions through real investment. But it would take years and years for Canada to recover from decades of underfunding. So it's not going to happen in a hurry. And I think to some extent Canada has to accept that Canada is no longer as major a player as we used to be, that other countries, you know, say South Korea or Brazil, have developed economies which are large and powerful and important in global affairs. So the assumption that Canada will always be invited to the big power table like G7 or other important Five Eyes intelligence sharing consortium is something that may not be happening in years ahead. We could see a change in the character of G7, and we could see Five Eyes dropping maybe Canada and New Zealand and bringing in Japan. So, you know, Canada's international role is one which is evolving, but I think the fundamental issue is the extent to which the government puts priority into international security, and the extent to which we appreciate that if we don't step up to the fore in Ukraine, if we don't step up to the fore in defense of Taiwan, that this will also affect Canada very seriously in the years ahead if a consortium of autocratic powers like Russia and China and Iran get together to overcome the liberal democratic-based world order and replace it with something based on Chinese power politics, which China defines as the community of the common destiny of mankind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your answer. You've basically outlined many other topics, and you've mentioned the security threat or concern, we can say, of China and Russia. So my next question is related to the Arctic. The North Pole is melting, mm-hmm. and both China and Russia are aspiring for this territory, which can pose a significant threat for Canada. So my question is, what has Canada been doing to address this concern? And do you think it's perhaps a space for a NATO action, or it should be dealt with at the bilateral level?
Well, we have seen some UK involvement in the Arctic for the reasons that you're defining. I mean, certainly Russia claims a lot of Arctic Sea that really would belong to Canada by the law of the sea. You know, the continental shelf extends out there. But, and China has defined itself as a near Arctic state and refers to the polar Silk Road. I mean, the idea that China is near Arctic is not geographically very valid. It's about as far from the Arctic as Yemen, but in any event, you know, they see this as an area that they could expand into. Canada's defense of the Arctic is pretty weak. I mean, you know, if you want to establish sovereignty over territory, you really have to be present there. And Canada does some, you know, scattered overflying of our territory up there, and some limited use of Inuit to travel over the area, and snowmobiles, a sort of modern equivalent of dog team. But our military presence in the Arctic is very low. We don't have a sufficient submarine or icebreaker capacity to really demonstrate sovereignty, whereas China has been developing the Shrelong icebreakers, and Russia is also very present there. So, the issue is really if there was, say, a global conflict, would Russia and China be able to establish a much stronger presence in the Arctic, which would present a threat to North American security? And, you know, that is a very real concern. We are looking into more investment, along with the United States, in the NORAD, the monitoring facility against incoming missiles and other activities up there. But you know, still, it's a long way off. China has attempted to make investments in the Arctic. There was an attempt by Shandong Gold to purchase a money-losing mine, a gold mine in the Arctic, But the gold mine was quite close to a NORAD facility and would have provided the potential for port facilities out into Arctic waters. And fortunately, I think the public concern about this was such that Canada prevented the Chinese government from establishing that state presence. Shandong Gold is a Chinese state company, not that that really matters in terms of Chinese investment, but you know, they would have had a presence right on Canadian soil of a strategic nature. But I think more of this will happen, and the extent to which China can use economic coercion to enable political decisions that would allow it to expand its geostrategic presence in the north is obviously a cause for concern. And you know, the question is really, how long do we wait until we start to take effective action to try and protect our security and sovereignty against increasing gradual encroachments by China? You know, as I say, they have an active icebreaker development program, which obviously will strengthen their position over a matter of years. They plan, you know, the Chinese plan in the long term, and I think they hope to use Russia as a kind of junior partner in an overall global scheme. So, you know, China's present in the Arctic, but China's also present throughout the world in all sorts of development of ports and other facilities that could be enabled when the situation demands. It's sort of like a game of Go or Weiqi, you know, this game where you have a large square board and black and white tiles, and the idea is that the black wants to surround the white and the white tries to surround the black, but it seems that China is playing that game while the rest of us are playing checkers or something like that. We don't seem to be really understanding what the game is, and China successively seems to position itself more and more. So it's really a question of raising awareness, I think, in the West of the future. And this is not a partisan political issue. It's really a foreign policy issue that nations should be united on. But so far, we're just not seeing enough awareness or willingness to allocate the resources in security and intelligence agencies and in terms of military hardware to keep up with the advances that Russia and China are making in this frightening global scheme. And if Russia wins in Ukraine, imagine the implications globally. I mean, obviously, once they've achieved a foothold in Ukraine, what's next? You know, Moldova, Slovakia, we just, you know, it's just too horrendous to contemplate.
Yeah, it's like disastrous scenario if it would happen. What you mentioned, it was a really nice metaphor of the game, and China has been very successful in spreading its influence, not only in the Arctic, but globally. I definitely agree with you. And I've been asking the same question to myself, like, what else does have to happen for Canada to take action? What else does have to happen for Canada to actually be aware of the security concerns and to act on it? I think it's definitely a matter of the government's steps they have to do. And yeah, the domestic issues are definitely important as well, but I think there's a problem that Canada might get surprised, like in the future, and they will say, okay, this is too late. It's kind of like the problem with Ukraine, that the European Union didn't act on it in 2014, and look at the consequences nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, we had a circumstance of a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party, a man who, you know, if he had succeeded, he hadn't. His name is Jean Charest, former leader of the party and former Premier of Quebec. And Mr. Charest had been quite sympathetic to the Huawei company in Canada, had been involved in organizing distinguished Canadians to try and shape public opinion and lobby the government to release the Huawei CFO, Meng Wanzhou, who was being held in Canada pending our legal process to investigate a U.S. extradition request to send her to the United States to face serious charges. Anyway, in the course of the leadership campaign, it became known that Mr. Charest had been receiving a retainer from the Huawei company as a lawyer for quite some time. There's speculation, I don't know if it's accurate or not, that he was getting $3,000 a month over a 3-year period, which would be quite a lot of money. This matter came up in the leadership campaign. It was not a major concern. It seemed that for most people, his policies in Quebec and so on were of more relevance. But from my point of view, you know, someone who had received money from a Chinese government-associated company with strong military links should be immediately ineligible to be the Prime Minister of Canada. But that opinion was not broadly shared. And he didn't win in the end, so the issue is a non-issue. But it really is a question of, as you say, how much does it take to get people to understand that this is real? We have had, due to the frustration of intelligence operatives at the base level, a number of top secret documents leaked to the press. So these are documents that were based on Canadian government monitoring of Chinese diplomatic facilities in Canada. Of course, the release of top secret documents is very troubling, particularly in terms of our intelligence sharing alliance with other nations. But it was brought about according to a statement made by the person who is alleged to have released these documents, because these documents were released to the press not anonymously, but the leaker is non-disclosed. In other words, the reporters who received the documents know who it is. And he expressed concern that the intelligence agencies were sending reports to the center of the government and they weren't acted on. And these reports were on matters such as harassment or attempts to harass the family members of Canadian parliamentarians who were of Chinese origin, kickback schemes where the Chinese government would identify candidates that they felt were sympathetic to their views and induce people belonging to Chinese proxy organizations to donate the maximum individual donation and then return to them from Chinese government funds the amount that cannot be deducted from tax. Revelations that a very generous donation to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation was given by someone who was thought to be a strong supporter of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's legacy, but in fact had been directed by the Chinese government to give that money, and the money came from the Chinese government, not from the donor. Any number of discussions of disinformation campaigns coordinated by the Chinese government to change, to discredit political candidates they didn't like, and so on and so on. So, you know, these revelations have added a great deal of credibility to people like myself who've been alleging these things. You know, since 2006, I've produced about over 200 opinion pieces in Canadian newspapers about China's threat, but these were all based on, you know, anecdotal and circumstantial things. You know, something's going on in Australia, it appears something similar is probably going on in Canada, let's do something about it, would be a common theme in my writings. But once we received the actual transcripts showing the conversations that Chinese diplomats had had with people, it became very much more real in Canada. So we now have a public inquiry that's been ordered by a judicial figure that is supposed to establish, you know, the degree of, I guess, culpability, or whether there is elite capture in Canada that means that there are people in the senior levels of our government who are beholden to the Chinese regime in some way, maybe some implied promise that after retirement from public service, if they haven't been identified by the Chinese regime as hostile to China and had kept quiet about Chinese concerns, that they would be rewarded in retirement with lucrative law firm opportunities or board memberships that wouldn't be open to them if they were on Chinese embassy lists of people who were prioritizing concern over China's security and sovereignty threat to Canada or over China's violation of norms of human rights, including the genocide in Xinjiang, for example. So, you know, all of these things are there. The question is really whether we can get people to see this as a national priority and cause it to change the way they vote in elections, or if these matters are simply talked about a lot and a lot of rhetoric comes out about the importance of it, but when it comes down to it, not enough is done to actually constrain violations of law inside Canada by agents of a foreign power.
You've perfectly paved the path for my next question that's still related to China. China is the second most important bilateral commercial partner for Canada. And at the same time, Canada is one of the biggest critics of China's violations of human rights and rule of law abuses, and especially towards Uyghurs, for example.
Yes.
I would like to ask you, will Canada prioritize human rights over trade opportunities with China? As based, for example, on one public survey, that around 76% of Canadians prefer that.
Human rights.
Human rights, yes.
Yes, that would be right. At least 76, I think. Yeah, I mean, for example, the Canadian Parliament, the House of Commons, had a unanimous resolution declaring China's activities in the area they call Xinjiang as constituting genocide under the Convention Against Genocide, which I think it's a reasonable assumption. If you look at the UN document defining genocide, there are any number of factors that suggest that China is in fact violating that international agreement. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Parliament at the time and declared that he would be abstaining on behalf of the Government of Canada, and the Prime Minister and the entire Cabinet absented themselves from the vote. So it's a unanimous resolution. In other words, no one voted against it, but our government sent a fairly reassuring message to the Chinese embassy, in my assessment, by the actual people that count in terms of policy and deciding things, not voting with this resolution. The other aspect is, as you say, certainly the Chinese government and their proxies suggest that if Canada offends China by challenging their domestic and international policies, you know, including their support for strongman regimes like North Korea, or, you know, in the Belt and Road program, the provision of surveillance technologies that allow for repression of political dissidents and religious freedom, or you know, any number of other things, that Canada will suffer economically. And at the time of our consideration of the Meng Wanzhou matter, Canada they applied non-tariff barriers to a Canadian export of canola seeds, a fairly important agricultural export for Canada. It was about, I don't know, $30 million a year or something like that, and also applied some non-tariff barriers to meat exports. But, you know, Canada's overall external commodities trade to China is about 4% of our external commodities trade. So we don't have anything like the dependence on the Chinese market as, say, Australia and New Zealand, who are more like about a third. And the kinds of products that we send to China are largely agricultural commodities and minerals. So if China was to, say, retaliate economically for something Canada did in a political area, let's say they declared a ban on Canadian soybean exports, and so they started to source from, say, Brazil and the United States instead. You know, Canadian soybean prices would go down, and that would then make us attractive in other markets. So I think, similar to the kind of economic coercion that China attempted against Australia, it wouldn't actually work, because, you know, there would be obviously disruption, and I wouldn't want to downplay the impact, but it wouldn't be devastating to the Canadian economy because it's only 4%, and also because, you know, it's relatively smooth to obtain alternative markets for those things because, you know, there's an international price and an international market for agricultural commodities and minerals. So I think a lot of it is really about effective Chinese propaganda to say to people, well, you know, if you're going to defend human rights internationally, you will be made to suffer economically. I don't think that in practice that actually has been the case.
Okay, thank you very much.
So far.
So far, yeah. I would like to get back to Canada's role in the international system, and I think we both can agree that Canada should spend more on military defense.
Yep.
But also my question is, in your opinion, do you think that there should be Canada's mission to become a spearhead when it comes to respecting human rights and promoting it, and not only towards China, but internationally as well? But could this be the role, like this is Canada in the international system?
I think it's certainly a role that Canada would like to play, you know, and we are quite active in the UN in forming resolutions, and you know, in the past, Canada has been active in the campaign against landmines and small weapons, and we also coordinated an international meeting and agreement on arbitrary detention after the Michael Kovrig and Michael Svaver were arbitrarily detained and imprisoned in China for 3 years to pressure our government with regard to Ms. Meng, as I referred to. And so I think that Canada does see a niche place in this. You know, in terms of what Canada can do, I guess Canada really has to be conscious of our limitations. And so I would urge, for example, that Canada focus on defense of the northern regions, as you referred to, and also, you know, does take a lead in trying to make nations accountable in human rights. But, you know, the question is really in what institutions, because the United Nations has not been effective in constraining China and Russia from participation in international human rights institutions and development institutions, and China is becoming more and more active in trying to dominate UN programming to serve China's overall Belt and Road and Community of the Common Destiny of Mankind agenda, and inserting Chinese language into UN documents that support Xi Jinping's overall global agenda. So I think certainly we should be pointing this out more vigorously. I think that part of it is also a lack of expertise in countries like Canada and probably here in Czechia with regard to understanding what China is really doing and being able to inform how governments respond in terms of public statements and forming alliances to try and use what resources we have to protect the international liberal order. And this is, you know, this is an ongoing challenge, because I think for young people specializing in knowledge of China and developing language expertise and understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party regime functions beyond normal categories of state-to-state behavior, it's not something that a bright young person would feel attracted to, because the topic is so dismal and it's so difficult to get access to China that we're seeing a decline in people who have this high-level expertise. And this is not solved in a year. It's a multi-year project to try and develop a cohort of people who can advise their governments on what's going on with regard to China. You need to have people who are able to get security clearances, so it eliminates, unfortunately, a lot of people of Chinese origin who have family in China that could be subject to coercion. And I think in general it's related to the nature of our political systems. I mean, in Czechia and Canada, you know, governments are based on limited terms of just a few years, whereas the Chinese Communist Party is looking for decades in advance, and their planning is based on much longer range than we're prepared to do. which is really why it's important to get this matter out of partisan political situations and see it as a national project that we should all be united behind.
Okay, thank you so much. I've got one last topic to cover before we end this interview, and that's strictly related to China. We both mentioned many concerns, and we discussed them already. We can mention the Belt and Road Initiative, the tensions over the territory disputes in the South China Sea, and the so-called ticking bomb called Taiwan. So I would like to ask you, because none of us have the crystal ball to predict what's going to happen, but I guess you get some assumptions, and also your expertise allows you to make some predictions, and also based on the current development and the China policy as well. My last question is, where do you see China in 5, 10, and 15 years?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, certainly, you know, we do have a lot of concerns about the Indo-Pacific. Canada has been active in monitoring the UN sanctions against North Korea, and North Korea is really just a proxy of China in a lot of ways, and also freedom of navigation exercises in the region. But you know, most recently, one of our Canadian planes almost had a crash with a Chinese plane. They came within 5 meters of our wings, and we've also had worry about Chinese ships that have been crossing across the bow of our ships, engaging in these exercises. So you wonder if China, you know, if you have so many close calls, eventually, inevitably, you're going to have an accident. And would China use that as the pretext for a larger confrontation? So many wars, you know, have started with some small precipitating incident. And so one wonders if China, if there was an accident, if this would prepare Chinese public opinion for a more aggressive Chinese military action, such as attempting to annex Taiwan. So, you know, if you looked at the Chinese projections, of course, they expect to achieve a society which is able to be a hegemonic power by 2050. That's, you know, the realization of the community of the common destiny of mankind. So this is based on the assumption that the United States is a power in decline, and that the multilateral institutions that preserve peace and prosperity, like the United Nations, like the WTO, like NATO, will simply wither away in favor of Chinese-based relations that China's been quite active in. And the Belt and Road Initiative is really the economic aspect of this. You know, the belts and roads all terminate in China, so it seems to be a desire for China to recreate its notion of being the Middle Kingdom and the all under heaven rule coming out of China, and denial of the equal sovereignty of states. So, you know, this is a scary idea. I'm not sure that this very audacious ambition can be realized. I think that they count out the vitality of the United States a bit too soon, and the idea that we would be prepared to accept, all of us, particularly, you know, smaller powers like Czechia and Canada, would be prepared to accept a subordinate position in a China-dominated world is still, I think, still too soon to say. So, you know, in terms of 5, 10, 15 years, you know, there are too many unknown factors to be able to say with certainty where it's going. I mean, the worst case scenario is that China does achieve this audacious plan, and I think we can't rule that out. I mean, if you look at what China is doing in terms of Taiwan and Indo-Pacific, if it's not preparations for war, then, you know, what are they doing? But I think it's hard for us to, just as in Ukraine, to believe that this is actually happening. I think even people in Taiwan in general, they've been so inured to the idea that China might invade, and they don't invade, that this latest stuff is something that they may not be taking in seriously enough. and the idea of the Belt and Road project, it has run into difficulties in implementation, so it isn't proceeding as rapidly as the Chinese might have hoped. I think that, you know, someone like Xi Jinping, who, you know, like Putin, is a unique figure who spends a lot of time reading history books and sees himself in the great flow of Chinese history as an imperial figure based on his feeling that he has Confucian sanction for his way of ruling. I mean, he won't last forever. Neither will Vladimir Putin. I mean, if they're not defeated as they get older and weaker by military coup or political coup, eventually the hand of God is going to cause them to leave power. And so the question would be, you know, once those countries recover from the experience of being subject to this kind of autocratic dictatorship, would countervailing forces emerge that would want to see China and Russia become stakeholders in a rules-based international order? You know, would they be prepared to work collaboratively with other countries to the benefit of peace and prosperity in the world? I mean, that would be the optimistic outcome of this. If Russia is decisively defeated in its Ukraine ambitions, and if China is defeated in its Taiwan ambitions, and therefore Putin and Xi lose nationalistic prestige in their own countries, maybe better regimes are ahead in the world, and before I die, I'll see a better world order based on the use of modern technology and economic advancement to the global good. Or maybe there are other issues to worry about, particularly, you know, artificial intelligence and non-state actors who don't support the rights of citizens and democracy becoming more and more dominant in our world. So at my age, I'm observing, but feeling that this is a problem for people of your generation to respond to, and I hope for better days ahead. But you know, we just can't be completely optimistic that things will go in a progressive and positive way, or the world might be entering into a dark period as those forces become more and more stronger and more consolidated, and we weakly just cower you know, complain about what's happening, but don't actually take the action to stop it.
Okay. Before you mentioned this last piece of information, I was about to say that we were going to finish this interview in a very positive way, actually. But I may alter it that we may finish it in a realistic way.
Yeah.
That's my perception. Dr. Burton, I would like to thank you again for accepting our invitation. It's been an honor and pleasure to make this interview with you. I hope that you enjoy your time in Prague, and I hope to see you soon again, because it's been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation, and I hope we can continue it before long.
Thank you.